In this chapter, we are going to be covering what is called macroeconomic equilibrium. So it's the macro counterparts that are similar to what we learned in chapter 3 in terms of demand and supply for a particular product. Now we're looking at the economy as a whole. You'll recall that in the last chapter, we learned all about the business cycle and the fact that the economy's output does not remain constant. So what we want to figure out is, what is it that causes a firm to increase or decrease the amount of output it produces? And what is it that causes consumers to purchase more or less of goods and services over time? Because remember, that's what basically is causing the changes in the business cycle. So to understand why we have the business cycle, we have to understand what's called aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So aggregate demand and aggregate supply are what we use to determine the equilibrium price level and quantity of goods produced for the entire economy. So here we see a diagram that is illustrating both aggregate demand and aggregate supply in a hypothetical economy. You'll notice that it looks very similar to the graphs that we did in chapter 3, where we were talking about equilibrium within a specific market for a good or service. But in this case, we're not looking at one particular good, we're looking at the economy as a whole. So aggregate demand, the pink line sloping downward, that represents spending in the economy at all the different price levels. In other words, the amount of goods and services that consumers are going to buy dependent upon what the current price level in the economy is. Whereas the aggregate supply curve, that's the upward sloping blue line, that represents the output of the economy at alternative price levels. So again, aggregate demand, that's representing all of the goods and services being purchased. Aggregate supply, that's representing all of the goods and services being produced. And then of course you'll notice that the point at which the two curves intersect, that creates what we call the equilibrium price level and real GDP in the economy. And of course what we believe is that once equilibrium is established, there is no tendency for prices and output to change until there's changes in either aggregate demand or aggregate supply. So of course, remember back in chapter 3, we learned that output and price will change if the demand or the supply curve shifts. It's the same concept here. If something occurs that's going to cause either the aggregate demand curve or the aggregate supply curve to shift, then that means that a new equilibrium will be reached in the economy. And so we can use this model to help us understand how, when there's changes in aggregate demand or aggregate supply, how that triggers the different phases of the business cycle and also triggers inflation. So again, as I have stated in this slide right here, we're going to use this diagram, we're going to use this model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply to help us understand the phases of the business cycle. Now let's focus on aggregate demand first. That was that downward sloping blue line. What we want to know is what's going to occur if aggregate demand increases. And if I'm saying that aggregate demand is increasing, then what that means is that the entire curve is shifting to the right, meaning consumers are actually going to buy more goods and services at every price level in the economy. Now, if the aggregate demand curve is shifting to the right, what that's going to do is cause the equilibrium level of real GDP to rise, which means it's going to trigger the expansionary phase of the business cycle. And so you recall in the last chapter, we learned that when it triggers the expansionary phase of the business cycle, firms respond to that by producing more goods and services. Therefore, they need to hire more people, so we should see the unemployment rate going down. At the same time, that increase in aggregate demand is going to cause the price levels to increase, and we call that demand pull inflation. So you recall that I introduced you to that concept in the last chapter, that when aggregate supply remains constant while demand is increasing overall for goods and services, it will create higher price levels. It's easier to understand when we go back and look at our diagram again. So let's say, for example, the economy was originally in equilibrium with aggregate demand curve 1. So we're right here. So we're at price level 1 with real GDP level 1. And again, let's say that the economy experiences an increase in aggregate demand. Then that would mean that we're shifting over here to aggregate demand curve 2. In other words, this is now becoming our new aggregate demand curve. So we shifted like so. And again, notice that aggregate supply remained constant. Therefore, real GDP was rising. In other words, firms were increasing the amount of output they produce in response to the higher price levels that were created by the increase in aggregate demand. So again, we see two things happening here. When aggregate demand is increasing, it's triggering the expansionary phase of the business cycle because real GDP is rising. Sorry, you know what, I'm not even going to write it. My pen has been acting funny lately, so it makes it difficult for me to write in a way that you can understand. So again, real GDP is going to increase when aggregate demand increases, so it causes the expansionary phase of the business cycle. And then at the same time, notice what happens to the price level. We went from P1 to P2 over here. And so it's also triggering the demand pull inflation. So price levels are getting pulled up by the increase in aggregate demand. So again, just to recap, on this graph, we can see when aggregate demand increases, real GDP increased from YE1 to YE2, triggering the expansionary phase, and price levels rose from PE1 to PE2, which again triggered demand pull inflation. Now, what's going to happen if there's a decrease in aggregate demand? In other words, let's say, for example, that consumers start buying less goods and services at every price level. Well, then in that case, the aggregate demand curve would be shifting to the left. In other words, that would actually cause real GDP to fall. If real GDP is falling, that's the same thing as saying the economy could be going into a recession. In other words, consumers are purchasing less goods and services at every price level. Firms are going to respond to that by decreasing the amount of output they produce. Therefore, unemployment rates probably will start going up. And again, the contractionary or recessionary phase of the business cycle will begin. So again, going back and looking at this graph again, if there's a decrease in aggregate demand, so again, hypothetically, we're starting right here where we were starting initially before, but now instead of shifting to the right, the demand curve is shifting down here to aggregate demand curve 3. So again, you can see what's going to happen. In other words, firms are going to respond to that decrease in consumer demand by decreasing the amount of output they produce. So look at down here when we're looking at real GDP. In other words, the amount of output that's being produced overall in the economy, it's now falling. It's going from equilibrium at Y1 to equilibrium at Y3. So real GDP is falling. And at the same time, look what effect it's going to have on the price level of goods and services. It's actually going to cause price levels to fall. So again, the opposite is occurring when consumer demand is decreasing at every price level in the economy. Rather than triggering the expansionary phase of the business cycle, we see that it's actually triggering the contractionary phase or a recession in the business cycle. Now, there can also be changes in aggregate supply in the economy, and that also can affect the business cycle. So let's say, for example, that firms start to increase the amount of goods and services they produce at every price level. Theoretically, this is going to cause the aggregate supply curve to shift to the right. And of course, that could probably be the result of better technology that's allowing firms to become more productive. In other words, increase their output, become more efficient due to those advances in technology, which is why they're able to increase the amount of goods and services that they're producing at every price level. Now, of course, when aggregate supply is increasing, this also can trigger the expansionary phase in the business cycle, but instead of causing the price levels to rise, it could cause the price levels to fall. So again, now we're looking at this a diagram again, an aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagram, but this time notice that aggregate demand remains constant and what's changing is aggregate supply. So again, suppose the economy was originally in equilibrium right here at aggregate supply curve 1 and aggregate demand curve 1, and there was an increase in aggregate supply due to advancements in technology. In other words, firms became more productive and efficient in the production process. Then what would happen is we should be shifting down here to aggregate supply curve 2. And so notice that the new equilibrium point is right here at YE2. So initially we were at YE1, now we're at YE2, which means real GDP has increased. So we've triggered the expansionary phase of the business cycle. Therefore, unemployment rates should be going down. At the same time, notice that the price levels are falling. So we originally were at PE1 and then we increased to PE2. So of course that's the opposite of what was happening when there was an increase in aggregate demand. When there was an increase in aggregate demand, it also triggered the expansionary phase. However, it also triggered demand pull inflation. But if the expansionary phase is triggered by an increase in aggregate supply, we should not see the same effect on the price level. The price level should actually be falling. Now let's say the opposite occurs with aggregate supply in the economy. Let's say that firms start producing less goods and services at every price level. One of the factors that could cause that to occur is, let's say that there's higher production costs. Let's say there's like a spike in resource prices. Therefore, we know that that's going to actually cause aggregate supply of goods and services to fall. And so graphically, that means we would be looking at the aggregate supply curve shifting to the left. If that occurs, then that's actually going to trigger the contractionary phase in the business cycle. And at the same time, it will cause what we called cost push inflation. So you recall when I talked about cost push inflation in the last chapter, I said that that's caused generally by an increase in resource costs for the firm. And so again, that's going to generally cause all price levels in the economy to rise when that occurs. So again, going back and looking at our graph, same thing. We start out in equilibrium right here at aggregate supply curve 1 and aggregate demand curve 1, but this time there's a decrease in aggregate supply. And so if there's a decrease in aggregate supply, we're going to be shifting to aggregate supply curve 3 right here, which again we clearly see causes that cost push inflation. In other words, the price level is now rising from PE1 to PE3. So the price level is going up in the economy, while at the same time, look at what's happening to real GDP down here. In other words, real GDP is falling. It's going from YE1 to YE3. So again, firms are decreasing the amount of output that they produce at every price level, causing, again, the recessionary or contractionary phase in the business cycle. So now that we've introduced ourselves to the theories of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, we can see how they directly impact the business cycle, what we learned about in the last chapter. We know that the reason why the business cycle occurs, why the economy grows and then peaks out and then contracts and then bottoms out and then grows again, is because of the changes in aggregate demand and aggregate supply that are going to occur over time. So the business cycle can result from either changes in aggregate demand, changes in aggregate supply, or changes in both. And then, of course, how severe the business cycle is, in other words, how long the economy grows or expands, or how long the economy contracts, or how severe the recession is, obviously depends on how far those curves are shifting. If you have an extremely high drop in aggregate demand, then that would, of course, cause a very severe recession. Whereas if it's just a small drop in aggregate demand, then it may be a very short recessionary phase. So again, how severe the business cycle is depends on how much we are altering aggregate demand and aggregate supply.